In launching the Crusades, the papacy sought to recruit members of one social grouping above all others, the Knights of Latin Europe. This military class was still at an early stage of development in the 11th century. The fundamental characteristic of medieval knighthood was the ability to fight as a mounted warrior. By modern standards, 11th century war horses were relatively small, indeed at an average 12 hands in height. Today, most would be classified as little more than ponies. Even so, they were cripplingly expensive to purchase and just as costly to maintain, requiring feed, horseshoes, and the care of a dedicated squire. Most knights also needed at least one additional lighter mount upon which to travel, but small as they were, these war horses still gave warriors huge advantages during hand-to-hand combat in terms of height, reach, speed, and mobility. As equipment, fighting techniques, and training improved, knights mounted on a stirruped and therefore more stable saddle also developed the ability to carry a heavy spear or lance couched underarm and learned to cooperate in a massed charge. The sheer brute force of this type of attack could utterly overwhelm an unprepared enemy. Knights were almost always accompanied by at least 4 or 5 followers who could act as servants, tending to their master's mount, weaponry, and welfare, but who also were capable of fighting as foot soldiers. When the Crusades began, these men were not members of full-time standing armies. Most knights were warriors, but also lords or vassals, landholders, and farmers, who would expect to give over no more than a few months in any one year to warfare, and even then did not usually fight in established, well-drilled groups. The standard forms of warfare in 11th century Europe, familiar to almost all knights, involved a mixture of short-distance raiding, skirmishing, which was usually a ragged affair characterized by chaotic close-quarter combat, and sieges of the many wood or stone-based castles littered throughout the West. Few Latin soldiers had experience of large-scale pitched battles because this form of conflict was incredibly unpredictable and therefore generally avoided. Virtually none would have fought in a protracted long-range campaign of the sort involved in crusading. As such, the holy wars in the East would require the warriors of Latin Christendom to adapt and improve some of their martial skills. Not marital skills. Before the preaching of the First Crusade, most Latin knights still regarded acts of bloodshed as inherently sinful, but they already were accustomed to the idea that in the eyes of God, certain forms of warfare were more justifiable than others. There also was some sense that the papacy even might be capable of sanctioning violence. At first sight, Christianity does not appear to be a pacifistic faith. The New Testament Gospels record many occasions when Jesus seemed to reject or prohibit violence. From his warning that he who lived by violence would die by violence, to the Sermon on the Mount's exhortation to turn the other cheek in response to a blow. The Old Testament also appears to offer clear guidance on the question of violence with the Mosaic commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." In the course of the first millennium CE, however, Christian theologians, pondering the union between their faith and the military empire of Rome, began to question whether Scripture really did offer such a decisive condemnation of warfare. The Old Testament certainly seemed equivocal, because as a history of the Hebrews' desperate struggle for survival, it described a series of holy wars sanctioned by God. This suggested that under the right circumstances, even vengeful or aggressive warfare might be permissible, and in the New Testament, Jesus had said that he came to bring not peace but a sword, and had used a whip of cords to beat money lenders out of the temple. The most influential early Christian thinker to wrestle with these issues was the North African bishop of named Saint Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE. His work laid the foundation upon which the papacy eventually built the notion of crusading. St. Augustine argued that a war could be both lawful and justifiable if fought under strict conditions. His complex theories were later simplified to produce just 3 prerequisites of a just war: proclamation by a legitimate authority, such as a king or bishop; a just cause, like defense against enemy attack or the recovery of lost territory; and prosecution with right intention, that is, with the least possible violence. And so we have simplified just war prerequisites: legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. These 3 Augustinian principles underpinned the crusading ideal, but they fell far short of advocating the sanctification of war. In the course of the early Middle Ages, Augustine's work was judged to demonstrate that certain unavoidable forms of military conflict might be justified and thus acceptable in the eyes of God, but fighting under these terms was still sinful. By contrast to Christian holy war, such as a crusade, was believed to be one that God actively supported, capable of bringing spiritual benefit to its participants. The chasm separating these 2 forms of violence was only bridged after centuries of sporadic and incremental theological experimentation. This process was accelerated by the martial enthusiasm of the post-Roman barbarian rulers of Europe. Their Christianization injected a new Germanic acceptance of warfare and warrior life into the Latin faith. Under the Carolingians, for example, bishops began sponsoring and even directing brutal campaigns of conquest and conversion against the pagans of Eastern Europe. And by the turn of the millennium, it had become relatively common for Christian clergy to bless weapons and armor, and the lives of various warrior saints were being celebrated. During the second half of the 11th century, Latin Christianity began to edge ever closer towards the acceptance of holy war. In early stages of the Reform movement, the papacy began to perceive the need for a military arm with which to reinforce its agenda and manifest its will. This prompted a succession of popes to experiment with the sponsoring of warfare, calling upon Christian supporters to defend the church in return for vaguely expressed forms of spiritual reward. It was under the forceful guidance of Pope Gregory VII that the doctrine and application of sacred violence jumped ahead. Intent upon recruiting a papal army that owed its allegiance to Rome, he set about reinterpreting Christian tradition. For centuries, theologians had characterized the internal spiritual battle that devoted Christians waged against sin as the warfare of Christ, and monks were sometimes described as the soldiers of Christ. Gregory twisted the idea to suit his purpose, proclaiming that all lay society had one overriding obligation: to defend the Latin Church as soldiers of Christ through actual physical warfare. Early in his pontificate, Gregory laid plans for a grand military enterprise that can be regarded as the first real prototype for a crusade. In the year 1074, he tried to launch a holy war in the eastern Mediterranean in aid of the Greek Orthodox Christians of Byzantium, who were, he claimed, daily being butchered like cattle by the Muslims of Asia Minor. Latins fighting in this campaign were promised a heavenly reward. His grandiose project fell flat, eliciting very limited recruitment, perhaps because Gregory had boldly pronounced his intention to lead the campaign in person during his pontificate. The Pope's 1074 formulation of the link between military service to God and the resultant spiritual recompense still lacked specificity. But in the early 1080s, with the conflict with the German emperor in full flow, Gregory VII took a critical step towards clarification. He wrote that his supporters should fight the imperator and face the danger of the coming battle for the remission of all their sins. This seemed to indicate that participation in this holy struggle had the same power to purify the soul as other forms of penance, because it promised, just like a pilgrimage, to be both difficult and perilous. As yet, this more logical explanation for the redemptive quality of sanctified violence did not take hold, but it set an important precedent for later popes. In fact, the very novelty of Gregory's radical approach to the militarization of Latin Christendom caused condemnation among some contemporaries, and he was accused in ecclesiastical circles of dabbing in practices new and unheard of throughout the centuries. His vision was so extreme that when his successor, Pope Urban II, offered a more measured and carefully constructed ideal, he appeared almost conservative in comparison and thus prompted less criticism. Well, Gregory VII had taken Latin theology to the brink of holy war, arguing that the Pope had the clear right to summon armies to fight for God in the Latin Church. He also went some considerable way to grounding the concept of sanctified violence within a penitential framework, an idea that would be part of the essence of crusading. Nonetheless, Gregory cannot be regarded as the prime architect of the Crusades, because he manifestly failed to construct a compelling and convincing notion of holy war, as that St. Augustine did, and resonated with the Christians of Europe. That would be the work of Pope Urban II. Again, we'll just repeat that. So, Gregory VII had taken Latin theology to the brink of holy war, arguing that the Pope had the clear right to summon armies to fight for God and the Latin Church. He went some considerable way to grounding the concept of sanctified violence within a penitential framework, an idea that would be part of the essence of crusading. Nonetheless, Gregory cannot be regarded as the prime architect of the Crusades because he manifestly failed to construct a compelling and convincing notion of holy war that resonated with the Christians of Europe. This would be the work of Pope Urban II. The Muslim world. From the end of the 11th century onwards, the Crusades pitted Western European Franks against the Muslims of Eastern Mediterranean. This was not because these holy wars were launched first and foremost to eradicate Islam or even to convert Muslims to the Christian faith. Rather, it was a consequence of Islam's dominion over the Holy Land and the sacred city of Jerusalem. The early history of Islam. According to Muslim tradition, Islam was born in the year 610 CE when Muhammad, an illiterate 40-year-old Arab native of Mecca in modern Saudi Arabia, began to experience a series of revelations from Allah, or God, relayed by the Archangel Gabriel. These revelations, regarded as the sacred and immutable words of God, were later set down in written form to become the Quran. During his lifetime, Muhammad set out to convert the pagan polytheist Arabs of Mecca and the surrounding Hijaz region on the Arabian Peninsula's western coast to the monotheistic faith of Islam. This proved to be no easy task. In the year 622, the Prophet was forced to flee to the nearby city of Medina, a journey which served as the starting date for the Muslim calendar, and he then waged a bloody and prolonged war of religion against Mecca, finally conquering the city shortly before his death in the year 632. The religion founded by Muhammad, Islam meaning submission to the will of God, had common roots with Judaism and Christianity. During his life, the Prophet came into contact with adherents of these two faiths in Arabia and the Eastern Roman Empire, and his revelations were presented as the perfecting refinement of these earlier religions. For this reason, Muhammad acknowledged the likes of Moses, Abraham, and even Christ or Jesus as prophets, and a whole surah or chapter of the Quran was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. During Muhammad's own life and in the few years immediately following his death, the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula were united under the banner of Islam. Over the next few decades, under the guidance of a series of able and ambitious caliphs, the Prophet's successors, these Muslim Arabs proved to be an almost unstoppable force. Their incredible martial dynamism was married to a seemingly insatiable appetite for conquest, a hunger sustained by the Quran's explicit demand for the Muslim faith and the rule of Islamic law to be spread unceasingly across the world. The Arab-Islamic approach to the subjugation of new territories also eased the path to exponential growth. Rather than requiring total submission and immediate conversion to Islam, the Muslims allowed peoples of the book, such as Jews and Christians, to continue in their faiths in return for the payment of a poll tax. In the mid-630s, ferocious armies of highly mobile mounted Arab tribesmen began to pour out of the Arabian Peninsula. By 650, they had achieved startling success with mercurial speed. Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Egypt were absorbed into the new Arab Islamic State. Over the next century, the pace of expansion slowed from this breakneck pace, but inexorable gains continued, such that in the mid-8th century, the Muslim world stretched from the Indus River Valley and the borders of China in the east across to North Africa to Spain and southern France in the west. In the context of crusading history, a critical stage in this whole process was the capture of Jerusalem in the year 638 from the Greek Christians of Byzantium. This ancient city came to be revered as Islam's third holiest site after Mecca and Medina. In part, this was due to Islam's Abrahamic heritage, but it was also dependent upon the belief that Muhammad had ascended to heaven from Jerusalem during his night journey, and the associated tradition identifying the holy city as the focus for the impending end of days. It was once popular to suggest that the Islamic world might have swept across all of Europe had not the Muslims been twice thwarted in their attempts to capture Constantinople in 673 and 718, and then defeated in 732 at Poitiers by Charlemagne's Frankish grandfather, Charles the Hammer. In fact, important as these reversals were, a fundamental and profoundly limiting weakness within Islam had already shown its face. Intractable and embittered religious and political division. At their core, these issues related to disputes over the legitimacy of Muhammad's caliphal successors and the interpretation of his revelations. Problems were apparent as early as the year 661, when the established line of rightly guided caliphs ended with the death of Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and the rise of a rival Arab clan, the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyads moved the capital of the Muslim world beyond the confines of Arabia for the first time, settling in the great Syrian metropolis of Damascus, and they held sway over Islam until the mid-8th century. However, this same period witnessed the emergence of the Shia, literally the party or faction, a Muslim sect who argued that only descendants of Ali and his wife Fatima, Muhammad's daughter, could lawfully hold the title of caliph. Shiite Muslims initially set out to contest the political authority of the mainstream Sunni form of Islam, but over time the schism between these two branches of the faith took on a doctrinal dimension as Shiites developed distinct approaches to theology, religious ritual, and law. And again, it's the Shiites are the ones who hold that only the descendants of Ali and his wife Fatima, which is Muhammad's daughter, could lawfully hold the title of caliph. And then the Sunni Islam, so Islamic people, Muslims would be the people who do not believe in that. Here we have the fragmentation of the Muslim world. Over the next 4 centuries, the divisions within the Muslim world deepened and proliferated. In the year 750, a bloody coup brought Umayyad rule to an end, propelling another Arab dynasty, the Abbasids, to power. They shifted the center of Sunni Islam even further from the Arabian homelands, founding a spectacular new capital in Iraq, the purpose-built city of Baghdad. This visionary measure had profound and far-reaching consequences. It heralded a comprehensive political, cultural, and economic reorientation on the part of the Sunni ruling elite, away from the Levantine Near East to the Mesopotamia, the cradle of ancient civilization between the mighty Euphrates and Tigris rivers, sometimes known as the Fertile Crescent, and further east into Persian Iran and beyond. Abbasid patronage also transformed Baghdad into one of the world's largest centers of scientific and philosophical learning. For the next 500 years, the heart of Sunni Islam lay not in Syria or the Holy Land, but in Iraq and Iran. And again, of course, we've already gone in our philosophical readings about the Arabic Persian philosophy, and of course science as well. Anyway, communities of the Abbasid ascendancy coincided with the gradual dismemberment and fragmentation of the monolithic Islamic State. The Muslim rulers of Iberia, sometimes known as the Moors, broke away to establish an independent realm in the 8th century. Again, that's the Muslim rulers in Iberia, the Moors. establishing independent realm in the 8th century, and over the decades, the rifts between the Sunni and Shia strands of Islam gradually intensified. Communities of Shiite Muslims continued to live largely in peace alongside among Sunnis across the Near Middle East, but in the year 969, a particularly assertive Shiite faction seized control of North Africa, championed by a dynasty known as the Fatimids, because they claimed descent from Fatima, or Fatimids. Again, Fatima was Muhammad's daughter. They set up their own rival Shiite caliph, rejecting Sunni Baghdad's authority. The Fatimids soon proved themselves to be a potent adversary, conquering large swathes of the Near East from the Abbasids, including Jerusalem, Damascus, and sections of the eastern Mediterranean coastline. By the late 11th century, the Abbasids and Fatimids regarded each other as avowed foes. Thus, by the time of the Crusades, Islam was riven by an elemental schism, one that prevented the Muslim rulers of Egypt and Iraq from offering any form of coordinated or concerted resistance to Christian invasion. Even as the enmity between the Sunnis and Shiites hardened, the degree of influence exercised by both the Abbasid and Fatimid caliphs dwindled. They remained as nominal figureheads in theory, retaining absolute control over religious and political affairs, but in practice, executive power came to be wielded by their secular lieutenants. In Baghdad, the Sultan; in Cairo, the Vizier. A further dramatic change transformed the world of Islam in the 11th century, the coming of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. From around 1040, the nomadic tribesmen from Central Asia, noted for their warlike character and agile skill as mounted archers, began to seep into the Middle East. One particular clan, the Seljuks from the steppes of Russia beyond the Aral Sea, spearheaded the Turkish migration. Having adopted the religion of Sunni Islam, these fearsome Seljuks declared their unswerving allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph and readily supplanted the now sedentary Arab and Persian aristocracy of Iran and Iraq. By 1055, the Seljuk warlord Tugrul Beg had been appointed as Sultan of Baghdad and could claim effective lordship over Sunni Islam, a role which members of his dynasty would hold as a hereditary right for more than a century. The advent of the Seljuk Turks brought a new vital lease of life and unity to the Abbasid world. Their restless energy and martial ferocity soon brought sweeping gains. To the south, the Fatimids were driven back and Damascus and Jerusalem reconquered. Notable victories were scored against the Byzantines in Asia Minor, and a Seljuk splinter group eventually founded their own independent sultanate in Anatolia. By the early 1090s, the Seljuks had reshaped the Sunni Muslim world. Toghrul Beg's able and ambitious grandson Malik Shah held the office of sultan, and together with his brother Tutush enjoyed relatively secure rule of Mesopotamia and most of the Levant. This new Turkish empire, sometimes referred to as the Great Seljuk Sultanate of Baghdad, was forged through ruthless despotism and the presentation of the Shiites as dangerous heretical enemies against the Sunnis, whom the Sunnis must unite. But when Malik Shah died in 1092, his mighty realm quickly collapsed amid succession crises and chaotic civil war. His two young sons fought to be named sultan, contesting control of Iraq and Iran, while in Syria, Tutush sought to seize power for himself. When he died in 1095, his sons Ridwan and Dukak likewise squabbled over their inheritance, snatching Aleppo and Damascus respectively. At the same time, conditions in Shiite Egypt were little better. Here, too, the precipitous death of the Fatimid Caliph and his vizier in 1094 and 1095 brought sudden change, culminating in the rise of a new vizier of Armenian heritage, Al-Afdal. Thus, in the very year that the Crusades began, Sunni Islam was in a turbulent state of disarray, and a new ruler of Fatimid Egypt was just finding his feet. There is no evidence to suggest that Christians in the West knew of these manifold difficulties, so they cannot be regarded as a definite trigger for the Holy War to come. Even so, the timing of the First Crusade was remarkably propitious. Anyways, we'll stop there, and then we'll have our fourth part. We'll do the third part before moving on.